All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's start off with the week ahead. Tomorrow I will be in Wellington. On Wednesday I will speak at the Chinese New Year celebrations here at Parliament. On Thursday I will travel to Hawke's Bay for a launch event for our Lunches in Schools program, as well as visit the new Hawke's Bay Opera House Arts and Events Precinct. In the evening, I will be presenting at the New Zealander of the Year Awards in Auckland. On Friday, my local electorate, I will open Western Springs' new campus. Later that day, I will host the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea at Government House. Today, I want to update you on the government's response to coronavirus, or as it's of course now being called COVID-19. While we continue to have no cases of the virus in New Zealand, you will have seen on the weekend we made the decision to keep in place the current travel restrictions from China as a precautionary measure for a further 8 days, a position that is being continuously reviewed every 48 hours and one that is based on the best available science and health advice. The government's primary objective must always be, first and foremost, the public health of New Zealanders. This is not to preclude the steps we're also taking to limit the effect as much as possible on the New Zealand economy. Today at Cabinet we discussed updated Treasury advice on the economic impact of coronavirus. I know that's something that you've previously asked me questions on, so I'm happy to share with you some of that advice. While it's still too early to know what the overall impact coronavirus will have on New Zealand's economy, agencies have been working to understand and mitigate the economic impacts of the virus. Treasury's advice is that coronavirus will have a negative, but they believe at this stage, temporary impact on GDP. While it's clear this will have an effect on the first and second quarter of 2020, Treasury expect economic activity to return to normal as global growth picks up and supply conditions normalise in the second half of 2020. And of course, keeping in mind the lags for when that will then be reported on in terms of GDP impacts. Ultimately, GDP growth is expected, therefore, to be around 2% to 2.5% in 2020. Now, this is not unique to New Zealand. The global impact, of course, is being felt widely, of course, not least in China itself. The effects that we're expecting, though, in New Zealand span from primary education and tourism sectors, the latter already feeling those impacts and those effects, of course, because of the temporary border controls that are in place. Now, we can head off global impacts of this type because our economy ultimately is in good shape. And so alongside the foundations that we have built, we have taken proactive steps and as a government decided that we will be investing an initial $11 million into a tourism package to support what is an incredibly important sector to New Zealand. And it's an acknowledgement of the crucial role China plays in our tourism industry. Now, specifically at this stage, it will include $10 million for Tourism New Zealand to diversify its marketing in other countries to offset the fall in Chinese traffic and diversify the visitor portfolio and stimulate the economy. You might recall we already talked about there being roughly $3 million also be redirected from within Tourism New Zealand to also boost those diversification initiatives. $1 million will also go towards funding for domestic marketing by regional tourism organisations in affected regions. Too often we perhaps neglect our domestic tourism market. We know that those regions that are specifically being impacted by the decrease in Chinese tourism are, for instance, Auckland, Rotorua and Queenstown in particular. And I understand also Christchurch. So this is about making sure that we're boosting the domestic market into those areas. Now, this is a start. We have an expectation as well that the tourism sector will do further work to rebuild the Chinese visitor market and New Zealand's hosting capabilities. So that is something we've asked Tourism New Zealand to do work on so that once we're in a position to do so, we will rebuild that sector within China as well. So I expect that we will come back to that. We know there will be people around the world who will be looking for a place to visit at the moment, and we envisage this increased marketing will particularly help with Australia, the UK, USA and Asia to New Zealand. And we hope that this short-term investment will help to alleviate some of the pressures our tourism sector are feeling post the border closures with China. Look, but otherwise I am now happy to take questions. Yes, we had a report from Minister Jones today. He'll be bringing a paper before Cabinet Committee this week, but his brief to us covered off the fact that now at ports we're really getting to a point that they're almost near capacity in receiving logs, which is something as we've already discussed. So we're again looking at potential initiatives for the logging sector, being quite broadly minded as to whether or not there's the ability to use some of those harvesting crews or redeploy harvesting crews for other challenges that we're facing at the moment in New Zealand. So already when we tend to have these issues, and we've raised the same issue with tourism, there's flexibility with IRD around particularly provisional tax, but we do want to look specifically at some of those who are contractors who are already feeling the impacts. So there are those, of course, who work in harvesting, where there's pretty quick decisions being made not to add to the backlog, as it were. And so that means thinking about what we specifically might be able to do to have a benefit or at least offset the impact for those who are harvesting in particular. Yeah. Yep. Oh, just go. No, it's fine, it's fine. Yeah.
In terms of getting them up, why now? Because we're only a few days before the quarantine lapses. Why act now with Australia? Why not just leave it?
Well, essentially because indeed the quarantine's coming to an end. So obviously they're going to need to find their way back to New Zealand, but there has already been some discussion about whether or not there needs to be additional quarantine for those individuals. And obviously, as you can imagine, given that they have been quarantined for so long for that period of time on the cruise ship itself, as you can expect, there is some distress amongst those New Zealanders around potentially being away from New Zealand even longer. Other countries, as you know, are looking at assisted evacuations and supporting quarantine in their own countries, and so we're doing the same. Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
Can I just clarify with you? So you will consider, or it's been considered that they will be
Yeah.
another quarantine.
Yeah, so one of the issues that exists, of course, is that people were kept on the cruise ship because for the purposes of quarantine, but there has continued to be this spread of coronavirus during that quarantine period. So question mark there over whether or not it's been successful. Of course, our job is to make sure as we bring those New Zealanders home that we're looking after their health and the public health of people around them. So at the moment we have officials working through the best way to manage that. Yes, they will need to be in a quarantine of some form. We're working through what that would look like, how we can support them, of course, given so many of them have been away from their families for so long, but we're looking into the detail of that. I know, though, they'll be pleased that we're looking to try and get them home.
GDP growth is up 2 to 2.5% this year. Is that a new forecast? And if so, when did you get it and who from?
So that's Treasury's estimates at this stage. You'll recall that their estimates were prior at 2.2 to 2.8. So within some of the estimates that you will have seen, the Reserve Bank was looking at an impact of 0.3%. Banks were looking at between 0.5 and 0.6%. And so obviously at this stage, there is a wide range of different there's a range of different speculative numbers being put out there. What Treasury is saying that this is their current view. Again, I think really this is confirmation that really from all quarters now, everyone believes there will be an impact. The question is how large and for how long. Oh, look, ultimately I can see that this is really being based on the information we have here and now, and it is based on assumptions around it being temporary. Keep in mind, these impacts are because of equally the knock-on effect of the impact within China itself. So this isn't just saying that because of the measures New Zealand is taking that we're seeing these figures. It's because of the global environment we operate in, and China themselves, of course, downsizing their forecast for growth as you would expect as well. I'll come back to you if that's okay. Yeah.
All of the 11 New Zealanders that are on the cruise ship, do they all actually live in New Zealand? Are they all coming back? And can you give an update on the 2?
Yes. I don't have specific details, of course, on the current status of the 2. You'd expect as well, though, that we are making sure that we look after their privacy. But they are in very close contact with our consular assistants in Japan. For the other 11, it's my current understanding that, yes, they would all be coming back to New Zealand and that they consider themselves and are travelling on New Zealand documentation. That's my understanding. At least that's a number I've been given that would be interested in coming, keen to come back into New Zealand and therefore would hold the travel documentation to do so. As I said this morning, I had a conversation early evening yesterday with Scott Morrison. They're still working through potential plans themselves. They haven't finalised anything or confirmed anything. But what he was able to do was respond for our request, given our numbers are relatively small, that they have said yes, they would be happy to accommodate 11 New Zealanders if they are to confirm an assisted evacuation. Sorry? That is my current understanding, but what has been the case for every assisted evacuation so far is anyone who has been unwell has been unable to travel. That, of course, is because, of course, if they're a suspected case, you wouldn't want them in close confines travelling with other passengers. So anyone who is deemed to be unwell would need to stay behind. Oh, Jackson, and then I'll come to you in a moment, Tova. Jackson.
I know nothing's been confirmed, but did Scott Morrison provide a rough sort of time frame for when he wants this assistance?
Oh, look, all of those details I really see as matters for Australia, and so I wouldn't want to get ahead of their decision-making process because, as I've said, they're still working through a number of questions for their own potential assisted evacuation, if indeed that is what goes ahead. Tova. Of course, I've seen the Deputy Prime Minister at Cabinet, but at Cabinet we discussed matters such as coronavirus, the tourism package, a number of other issues. But no, I have not discussed that issue with him directly.
So you don't think it's that important
I did not consider it a matter that needed to be discussed at Cabinet or by the government. Instead, I prioritised issues like coronavirus. Yeah, sorry, Benedict. Look, I've already given my personal view on the issue of, in fact, this is long-standing, on the issues of blogs like the one that's being referenced in this case. I personally dislike them. I don't think they add anything to New Zealand or New Zealand politics. And that is a view that I've held for a number of years, right back to the first time we had a debate about dirty politics. Yeah. I would obviously dispute that.
Universities are calling for an exception on the travel ban for
Yeah.
Chinese students. Is the government open to this?
As I said this morning, look, we have received that request from the university sector in particular. They are obviously not the only sector within the education system that are reliant on overseas students, or not reliant on them, have a cohort of overseas students. That includes PTEs, it includes secondary schools, includes, of course, the university sector and polytechs as well. And so for those different groups, they have different numbers that they're expecting. For those private training establishments, a large number of students are already here. For the universities, they have a bit of flexibility time-wise, but we're very conscious of that. We've extended their visas. They are able to engage in online learning, and there is the possibility of them enrolling in term 2. But even then, we are looking at the logistics of what it would mean to have an exemption, keeping in mind some pretty big hurdles, the ability to quarantine and isolate individuals who come in. Of course, they are new to New Zealand and would need to therefore be quarantined by the universities themselves. So that's the first hurdle. The second, of course, is that they would individually need to be processed, and that's quite a significant undertaking. But we are exploring those issues with the university sector.
Are there any standards of behaviour that you believe minor parties in your government should adhere to? Standards at all?
Oh, of course.
And do you think they haven't been breached on this occasion? So the photographing of journalists is above those standards that you set? Above that line?
Look, ultimately, you're asking me to act as judge and jury in what is a case involving party members and past leaders of that party. And as I've said before, there are many, many matters for which I am responsible, but an internal dispute between a political party is simply not one of them. Yep, I'll let you finish your question. Yep.
You've shown no desire to have any information or any knowledge of this at all.
No, again,
Not being judge or jury.
look, ultimately, I absolutely respect and appreciate the interest that you all as journalists will have in this issue. But the question you're asking me is it for me as Prime Minister to preside over that issue, which is ultimately a matter for another political party? I'm responsible for the government, for focusing on issues like a strong economy, the handling of things like coronavirus, and as Labour leader for the conduct of my own party. But in an election year, there's going to be a number of issues that will come back to party political matters for which I need to lead other leaders be responsible for. Yeah, Joe.
Your party in opposition was heavily critical of the last National League government for its hat wearing. Is that not exactly what you're doing right now by making Winston Peters the New Zealand First leader instead of accepting that he's also the deputy?
Again, as I've clearly set out here, you're asking me in this case to act as the inquirer into an issue involving internal matters of the New Zealand First Party, as opposed to past circumstances which have involved individual staff members of the government of the day. So I do see that as being something that you are totally within your rights to be questioning other party leaders about. Tova.
Are you saying you have no care, authority or control over any other
No,
in your cabinet?
I have given you a specific view on some of the issues at hand here, around, for instance, the use of particular blogs within New Zealand that I have a distaste for and see as adding nothing to the New Zealand political landscape, and I've very clearly given that view. But ultimately what you are asking about is an internal party political matter for which you are totally within your rights to go and ask that party leader about. Yeah, in the front.
The cabinet manual is pretty explicit that ministers have to uphold the highest ethical standard in both their ministerial, political, and personal roles. Is Winston Peters relying on this blog that you've expressed a distaste for upholding the highest ethical standard?
again, ultimately, I'm not the one to even make judgments over whether or not that involvement has existed in the first place. But again, I think I've clearly stated my position on this issue. Yeah, who hasn't asked a question here yet? Just one moment, I just want to hear the voice that hasn't asked a question. I'll come to you back in October in a minute, I just want to, yeah.
Simon Bridges gave a speech this morning or at lunchtime today when he promised 3% GDP growth
Yeah.
this year. Is that promise still in arrival given the coronavirus numbers? And is that a responsible thing to be doing in any case?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a couple of points to, I think, make. So coronavirus, we're looking at where GDP growth is expected to be over 2020. Going into 2021, we're already seeing forecasts for solid growth into that range already. And so if he wants to just simply agree with other Treasury forecasts, he's well within his rights to do so. But I don't think promoting it as a new target is exactly a new idea. But finally, ultimately, GDP growth is reliant on having a plan of some sort. Today, I didn't hear one. Contrast that, of course, with ourselves, where we've had a very strong focus on increasing productivity. We've introduced the R&D tax credit. We've had a strong focus on wage growth, which is why we're seeing those wage rates at 3.6%. That has a knock-on effect, helpfully, for people like our superannuitants. At the same time, we've had unemployment at 4%, a target we set ourselves as well, so that we have really a tight labour market, and that demonstrates, I think, the benefit of mana and mahi and the employment strategy we've rolled out. And we've focused on regional growth, and the PGF has made a huge difference there, alongside diversification in our trade agreements and trading partners. So we have had a plan. It's made a difference. I'd be interested to see what Nationals is. Jenna? Yep, I'll come to Jenna and then I'll come back to you. Yeah. As I've said, at the moment, this is exactly the expectation I have of a minister, is that in their ministerial capacity that they perform appropriately. And as when it comes to the Deputy Prime Minister, I've not raised any questions with that.
When does it become an issue of character though, in which obviously being transfers into his role as Deputy Prime Minister, which is your responsibility?
Again, I've given a very clear position on this. First of all, you're asking me to make judgments on issues that at the moment are built around an information on a blog I've already said I have a distaste for, and one tweet. And so I'm not going to draw all of those moral conclusions based on that. Secondly, I see those as issues for New Zealand first, not for me as Prime Minister of this government, and I'm focused on issues like the economic impacts of coronavirus right now. Yeah, Jenna, sorry. And then stated in a tweet that it was a supporter. Again, these are all questions better directed to the leader of New Zealand First. And as I've said many times before, at Cabinet today, my focus was on the economic impacts of coronavirus, not on that blog and not on a tweet.
Would you encourage him to step forward and answer our questions directly?
Ultimately, again, for every political party leader, the way they choose to engage with you in the media is a matter for them, and they're answerable, obviously, to you, the public, and others, and it's up to them to determine how they do that. Yeah. No, I'm not.
Prime Minister,
Yeah.
the Children's Commissioner has come out against the right to silence laws.
Yeah. Look, it won't sit well, I think, with any New Zealander to see a repeat of something that we've seen before. We have had a case in the past where there's been essentially stonewalling, which has made it very difficult for anyone to be held to account. And here, I share the same discomfort as the Children's Commissioner. Something happened to this boy that is patently clear, and now someone needs to be held responsible. When it comes to how we do that, I've had a brief conversation with the Minister of Justice today. He's going to undertake to go and have a look, obviously, at the current law. There were changes made, forgive me, I believe it was 2011. Ultimately, though, that was about individuals being held responsible for keeping a child safe. So it didn't directly relate to this, necessarily solve this problem that the police now have.
In a Guardian, sorry, shifting tack.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. In a Guardian article last year, Elton John was full of praise for you and said you're one of the few politicians that he respected and loved. I was just wondering, since he's been in New Zealand, have you caught up with him?
Yes, I did actually meet him.
What did you guys do? What happened?
We didn't sing a duet, if that's what you mean. We talked like normal people, but very briefly. It was before. No, nothing like that. It was before his show, and as you can imagine, he was busy preparing for his show. But I thought it was incredibly kind of him to give some time like that, given he obviously felt incredibly unwell as well.
What's your message to him now that he's obviously left the show because of illness and he's...
Oh, just I think what everyone would want to say, get well soon. And I think given he had what they call walking pneumonia, the fact that he spent roughly 2 hours on a stage giving such a huge performance, I think was incredible and very generous. The fact that he'd also travelled from New Zealand back to receive his Oscar, then back to New Zealand, also demonstrated the commitment he had to people here, which was really clear given he gave it his all yesterday.
Did he seem unwell when you met him?
Yeah, you could tell that he wasn't feeling well, and he said he wasn't feeling well, so I think you could see that on the stage last night, which I think is just a credit to his commitment to his fans. Oh, just a bit of politics. I might have commented on how Neve loves to dance to his music, just things that you would have a normal conversation about, yeah. I was going to the show. I don't know whether or not he knew I was going to the show. I would have to actually go back and check, but yeah, then the chance to meet him came up, yeah. Yes, yeah.
What, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
Oh yeah, very brief, 5 minutes or so, yeah. Look, I of course keep a close eye on rental data, and what we can see is actually rental increases have been fairly consistent actually over the last 5 years. We want that to come down though, and the most important thing we can do is increase the supply of houses, and that's why having, for instance, over 3,000 houses under construction and the largest government build program of any government since the 1970s can only help. Sorry, what was that? Yeah, so I would say that unfortunately the National Party created the housing system and the housing crisis that we are still trying to fix. And so if he believes that he is the one to fix it, I have to say I find that ultimately questionable at best. We are trying to still fix the problem he created. And I also heard he wanted to cancel the $300 million investment in homelessness. That's to create extra transitional housing places so people don't live on the street. So my question is, what is his plan on housing? Because I know what it looked like last time. Sorry? I know I will continue to be asked this question frequently given it's election year. For us in government, you can see what our agenda is. It's clear in our budget and the policies that we deliver. When it comes to the Labour Party's policy, we'll be delivering that closer to the election, but that's not something we've worked up yet. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
What's your message to them, and are you confident that the best chance to move the out of the Fines Act is now?
I do, and it is absolutely now, and the fact that we had such significant support from across the House, I think is the best indication of that. Granted, it was first reading, but I was still very heartened by those numbers. And so, there will be people on both sides of the argument who won't be 100% happy with the final version of the bill, but it is a huge improvement on what we have had in the past, and so I do think it will garner the majority support of this House. Okay, I'll take these last ones.
The budget, I imagine. Are you revising the budget to take
Oh, look, again, as I think the caveats that I gave is that these are very early predictions. And this is a briefing that was received today and that I'm now sharing with you. Ultimately, those will all be matters for later on. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Can you do one more?
Oh, look, there's 1 minute left on the clock.
Just on housing, do house prices need to fall?
We have seen significant stabilisation in the Auckland market, and this is something that I do keep a close eye on. But not just that, the percentage of first home buyers in that market, which we've seen move from roughly 18% to 24%. That's exactly the kinds of signs we wanted to see of first home buyers being able to access the market, and a sign that, for instance, our ban on foreign buyers in our residential market is having an effect. Okay.